Injuries. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and a motion adopted on January 18, 2022, the committee is resuming its study of illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. And from the Outlaw Ocean Project, we have Mr. Ian Urbina, Director. So we go to Mr. Urbina for 5 minutes or less, please.
Thank you. My name is Ian Urbina. I'm the director of the Outlaw Ocean Project. We're a journalism organization based in Washington, D.C. I spent 2 decades at the New York Times on the investigative unit, and the last big investigation I conducted there was looking at human rights and environmental crimes on the watery 2/3 of the planet. After leaving the Times, I created my own shop, if you will. We're a team of 12, decentralized, and we do sort of deep dive investigative projects. Again, reporting always at sea on the fishing vessels if fishing is the target. The last 4 years was spent specifically looking at the Chinese distant water fishing fleet, those vessels in foreign waters or high seas. We focused on China in particular, and it's of great relevance to Canada in particular because it is the superpower of seafood in 2 metrics. One, the number and tonnage pull of vessels on the water around the world. China has more distant water fishing vessels than the next largest fleet by a factor of 10. Secondly, they're the superpower of seafood because of their processing capacity. Fish pulled out of Canadian waters by Canadian flag vessels, U.S. waters by U.S. flag vessels, French, German, etc., Spanish, is often landed in the home country and then frozen, shipped to China for processing, frozen again, shipped back. So China, for both of those reasons, is really the bottleneck of the global seafood supply chain. And so crimes, be they IUU or human rights on land and processing plants, are of great concern to the rest of the world, Canada included. What our investigation found was a global fleet that is China, and a processing infrastructure that is quite especially Shandong province in China that has myriad deep concerns. On the fishing vessels themselves, we found widespread problems of IUU. These came in various categories. AIS darkness, so vessels going invisible, going dark, turning off their transponders for long periods of time, often weeks and months, a violation of Chinese law and other rules. Ramming of other ships, Chinese vessels, incursions into foreign waters, Argentinian waters, West African waters where they're not licensed, using gear they're not permitted to use, human trafficking on the vessels, dumping of high grading, so dumping of fish when they can catch more fish, fishing in zones where they're not permitted, a wide variety of IUU-related crimes by this fleet, and then also severe human rights abuses on the vessels themselves. On land, we also found very deep concerns, and we continue to report that. Widespread use of Xinjiang Uyghur labor, so state-sponsored forced labor in processing infrastructure. One of the largest companies that's bringing a lot of seafood into the West is a company based in Canada, and one of many companies that we found that are importing seafood from processing plants that have widespread use of banned labor, either North Korean forced labor, state-sponsored forced labor, or Xinjiang Uyghur forced labor. So bottom line is there's a huge problem, and it gets back to import controls, supply chain tracing, a willingness of companies, be they Canadian, American, or any others, to actually reckon with whether they can actually keep track of the conditions on the vessels or in the processing plants. These are sort of the core concerns that the industry and government players are going to have to confront. I was just in Ottawa actually a week ago, meeting with folks in your Foreign Affairs office about some of the concerns that exist about laws that exist on the books for import controls and the ability under existing law for Canada to stop the import of certain seafood that's been tied to IUU or human rights, but a lack of political will and a lack of experience in using those laws. So there's growing pressure, I think, partially because of this investigation and the work of others, Morley and Oceana included, to really draw attention to some of these concerns. One final thing I would mention is that I do think there needs to be a reckoning of within the IUU and marine community with some of the issues that Oceana just raised and our investigation has been raising for a while, which is a redefinition of illegal fishing. If we're going to talk about IUU and not actually take into account concerns about sea slavery and human rights concerns in the processing infrastructure, we're going to actually end up having to solve a problem twice. If we have a bifurcated, siloed method of tackling IUU that doesn't include the human conditions, these same concerns within the seafood supply chain are going to come up again in a separate form. So I would encourage you folks to actually take a look at the definition of IUU and really think hard, as the U.S. is already, about incorporating new components in that definition. I'll end there. Thank you.
Mr. Urbina, wanted to just remind you that you're here as a witness in a parliamentary standing committee, and so you have certain privileges to disclose things that would otherwise get you in trouble out in the wide world. You mentioned that there is a Canadian company that's involved in importing fish from Asia, from China, I think you said. Can you name that company?
Sure. I mean, we've written extensively about it. It's Highliner Foods, and it's one of the main importers of large amounts of seafood into Canada.
Is this an error of omission or commission when it comes to the possibility of illegally caught fish coming into Canada through that company?
I can only speak of my suspicion that it's an unwitting error. I think the extent to which it's witting is that when these companies, it and many others, decide to go into China, they opt to play by the rules that exist there, and everyone knows what those rules are. And one of them is there are fundamental prohibitions against core things that you would need to actually check your supply chain. So, for example, the ability to do spot checks on processing plants. You don't show up unannounced to a Chinese processing plant. You need permission. Those folks know in advance. If you can't do spot checks on a processing plant, you can't get an honest assessment of, are there forced labor in that processing plant? So when companies go into China, they know the rules of engagement and they make a decision. That's witting. That's not unwitting. But whether this company or many others knew that they had North Korean or Xinjiang forced labor in the plants, I somewhat doubt that. But they didn't know for reasons that they did know, if you understand what I'm saying. And the similar point I would make is when it comes to the on-water crimes, the IU crimes of the vessels at sea, there's also an industry-wide witting sort of blind eye turned to the fact that spot checks are not done on vessels on the high seas, Chinese or otherwise. And so when you're getting your catch off of vessels, even if you have a certain amount of supply chain traceability and you know roughly what vessels that specific catch is coming from, you don't know what's going on the vessels, and you probably don't actually know what's going on in terms of where those vessels are fishing and what gear they're using.
For Mr. Urbina, in August of 2020, a colleague and I wrote Canada's federal fisheries minister to express our concerns to news reports of 260 vessels from the People's Republic of China's distant water fishing fleet pillaging fish populations in international waters beyond Ecuador's exclusive economic zone, in a significant fishing migration route between the Galapagos Islands and the Ecuadorian coast. When we received a response from the minister, she mentioned international agreements and discussions, but nothing about the actions being taken by Canada or partners to confront the China in response to conduct their distant water fishing fleet in the Galapagos. Mr. Urbina, are you aware of any governments or transitional organizations confronting China in response to their pillaging of the Galapagos fisheries in the summer of 2020?
Sure. So the 200 to 300 vessels that you're referring to are largely squid jiggers. They go every year and have been for a decade to those high seas waters near the Galapagos. We actually boarded those vessels and inspected their conditions and their supply chain, et cetera, and traced many of those vessels back to the Canadian market and also to the U.S. market and others. To answer your question more on point, the Chinese government, interestingly, because of the bad press that began in 2020, but has continued since then about that specific fleet and that specific location, ordered its vessels, that fleet specifically, to back off and stay 50 miles away from the line. Most of those vessels were already outside of Ecuador's waters and Galapagos waters, but they instructed them to stay further out. That doesn't mean that many of those vessels are not still engaging in IUU. In fact, they are, and we've documented them. Many of those same vessels are invading Argentinian waters, Peruvian waters, etc. In terms of government action, very little. Canadian mechanisms of pressure would be customs.
Thank you. Thank you. In your view, why aren't governments of countries like Canada and the U.S. confronting China to press them to stop their illegal activities of their distant water fishing fleet?
Seafood's cheaper.
Cheaper? Did you say because
Yeah,
it's
that-
cheaper?
For
Okay.
consumers.
Yeah,
Okay,
I mean,
service, okay.
why are all industries, textiles, et cetera, in China? Because it's cheaper.
We know there are many international agreements aimed at preventing IUU, but is there any international body that actually performs enforcement of international laws and regulations in international waters?
That may be so it depends on the species and the location, to be honest. So there are RFMOs in specific places that pertain to tuna, for example. Squid has very few. There is one RFMO in South America that pertains to squid, but it doesn't encompass the region you're discussing. So for the most part, the answer is no.
For international waters to be secured and protect from the Chinese illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing?
I missed the first part of your question.
Take for the international waters to be secured and protected?
Bunch of things. It would take Western brands in Canada, the U.S., and Europe to apply pressure on the companies that are tied, their own companies and foreign companies that are tied. It would take governments to set aside MPAs on high seas and have mechanisms to do that, such as the High Seas Biodiversity Treaty. It would take enforcement collaboration between many countries to arrest ships when they come in if they have documented abuses.
Okay, thank you.
I'll just quickly shift to you, Mr. Urbina. It seems both from your presentation and your website, which I had a brief look at, your entire focus is on China. I just wanted to clarify the relative contribution of seafood caught by Chinese vessels in terms of total global harvest. And are there other significant players that compare to China, either in volume or in practice?
No, our focus is not entirely on China. The last investigation was, but before that, we looked at the Thai fleet, before that, the Taiwanese fleet, and before that, the South Korean. So we just recently been turning to China. I think that to answer your question, the largest big players that are IUU connected are the largest big players. So you would in terms of the high seas fleets, you'd be looking at Taiwan, South Korea, Thai. As the next biggest players to be thinking about in terms of imports to Canada.